Young people are not the future of tabletop sports simulation or tabletop sports gaming, at least not the type of gaming that we know. Now, please tell me in the comments what you think about this, but let's go through some of the evidence that we have. None of it empirical. We don't have, and we have not done the investigation to get into the actual age groups, but it's a lot of anecdotal evidence and that gut feeling that accrues over time. If you followed us recently in our interviews with designers, if you go back to our interviews when we started APBA Football Club in 2011, the story is the same. Rinse, repeat. I started playing as a kid because a sibling or a parent or an uncle or a teacher got me into the game. This was back in the 50s or 60s or 70s, maybe even the 80s, before digital. We were watching digital games and content. And then I had to put the game down in college. I went to work, got married, had a family. I had to put the games away. And now I am a retiree and I am a returnee to the game that I loved, whatever game it is, APBA Strat, you name it, data-driven football. And I have all the time in the world to indulge this kind of passion that I had when I was a kid. Now, that's not to say young people won't get into sports gaming, but you're a very special breed to begin with to get into something that looks, has any components that look like this. If you're into something that looks like this, you have a particular way of looking at the world, I'd say. Now, what got me thinking about this is a few things, not just the folks that we've interviewed over the past year or two, or past 10, 12 years, 11 years, really. I was pulling out all my old Avalon Hill war games, and I was thinking about all those years in the 70s when I would really get into these games. And make no mistake, I was we of a certain vintage, a certain age, we had video games in the form of arcades. My father and I poured umpteen tons of quarters into pinball machines and the early, stand-up games. And then, of course, in the early 80s, the Space Invader and Miss Pac-Man, things like that. But, we just didn't have all the digital availability that you have now. Clearly goes without saying. I've talked about the running hyphen, that little Mattel handheld football game that came out, and I and others like me, and certainly most folks watching this channel, the demographic data in your analytics dashboard don't lie. Most of us grew up at a time where we started to grow into. You started seeing Texas Instruments and the Atom and the Commodore 64, all these consoles coming out. Now growing up, you see, our kids or our nieces, nephews, they're so into handheld, Game Boys and Nintendos and you name it, never mind the Madden onslaught and all the Segas and the PlayStations and the Wii, and I love them all as well. But, the difference for us is that we kind of grew through this era of, cards, dice, paper, and numbers, lots of numbers without a lot of aesthetic, something like this new bottom of the ninth, which I think is part of the future. And thank you to Philip Schwartzman. He runs the San Francisco Board Game Design Group, for turning us on to that game. This is kind of a game that straddles that area between aesthetic and statistics. When I go back and listen to some of the folks who we've interviewed, Brian Hafferkamp, who designs on-base baseball and up-tempo basketball, and he's got a quick drive football game coming. He said perhaps the most telling thing I've heard of late, and that is that folks of his age group, or for folks of his age group, there is no golden age of sports. It's not like if you grew up in the 70s and you saw the terrible towels waving, that was a new thing. Regional pride in the team, and Pittsburgh, a city that really needed something to cheer for. In the 80s, Magic and Bird with the Celtics and Lakers. I mean, it's hard to capture that kind of lightning in a bottle. I mean, the NBA, fortunately they had Jordan to follow up, with that. But I mean, you don't get a product like that on the field every day. And to be sure, the nature of sports has changed with free agency. I mean, that goes without saying as well. So as the nature of sports changes, does the nature of the sports fan change? And does the sense of what a sport, what we're seeking in a game change along with that? So, I was pulling out all these Avalon Hill war games, my B-17 Queen of the Skies. Really, my great love was Rick Toffin's War, you know. And I was a 10-year-old, 12-year-old kid, but this is in the 70s, you know. And to be sure, you've got to be a kind of a special kid with no negative connotation there. But let's face it, you know, I never bought APBA football expecting to play with anybody because I didn't think, I mean, among my immediate friends, if they were not playing Pee Wee football or Little League, then they were playing Monopoly or going to Burger King with the football team and the cheerleaders or going to a concert or listening to, you know, hanging out with their brothers and sisters or something. But, you know, only child, moved around a lot, you know, you kind of just have an inherent love of something like a squad leader. And you look at something like this and you say, gee, I want to spend hours of my day poring over something with a rule book that looks a little something like this. It's fairly dense. You know, you're in the minority to begin with, whether you grew up in the 70s or, you know, were born in the 2000s. You know, it takes a special kind of person as a young kid, a kid to want to do this, you know, and certainly that type of person is even rarer these days when you're awash in all the digital content available on your phone, your tablet, your watch, you know, your VR goggles, whatever. So, but to me, as a little 14-year-old kid, this is what I was doing. It's some of my dad's non-repro blue pen from the newspaper in there. I'm sure I played this game so horribly wrong. It's pathetic. I wish I had audio or video of my playing of these games, but you know, you have to be someone who really likes to take the time with games, you know. And we certainly didn't have any Discord or Twitch or anything like that to stream through. So when you're a certain kind of person playing these games in that era, you know, and then you grow up in the digital world as it emerges, you're a different kind of person than the kind of person who is growing up today playing these games. Now, in the 90s, APBA, among other companies, I'm sure, tried to target these youths, tried to keep up with the times. They started coming out with PC games. They came out with a couple of items in 2000, in addition to redesigning the basic football and baseball games in these big full color boxes with the cards, full color cards with the logos, team logos on them. They tried to tap into a couple of different avenues for creating a gateway game. They came up with this Pro Bowl set, okay, and this played very differently than the regular game. They simplified it to one run, just a run play and a pass play. You call one or the other and you have a chart of the results. Jason Graham, who's come back recently, Jason, great job. He was working with this game a bit. He and I talked a little bit about it. He created even another chart to go with this kind of game and, you know, really stripped it down. So it's kind of a gateway into that bigger realm of, you know, Mondo results. But what they also did, APBA did, even in the midst of all this kind of change in the 90s and into the 2000s, they came up with this kids game called Superstars Football. Okay. And it really didn't have much to do with, you know, the games that we know at all, because it had this kind of maze-like thing, and you had the Superstars cards here. I mean, who doesn't remember Tim Couch, huh? And, you know, you had some results on the back here. It says short run for first down. And basically you're moving, you know, around the board, you're moving your guys until you get to the end and you win. And what does it say? There's a discard pile, a pickup pile, free turn, and you get to the touchdown, the end zone right there. Okay, where is it over there? Okay, so, you know, Apple was cognizant of trying to maintain its hold on youth, and other companies were certainly thinking about that as well. But it was just, you know, such a different era. And as digital content outstripped these cards and dice games, well, you know, it just makes all the sense in the world that, you know, it's harder and harder to reach these kids. Now, make no mistake, people are buying games, and we all know it. You know, if you follow us on Instagram, you follow the folks we follow on Instagram, we've talked about this, the shelves groaning with game after game after game. Kickstarter games, I mean, they're just coming out every millisecond. We backed so many of them, and they're beautiful games, and people love them. Gartenbau just came out, and it's elegant. It is no nonsense. It is deeply, deeply tactile. You got great little equipment, little incentives. So people love this stuff. They haven't shied away from gaming by any means. I mean, you get these nice wood tokens if you're a backer. You got the little wheelbarrow for your token, which is the standard with the game. You've also got very clear, colorful directions, right? So, it's not that people aren't playing games, particularly in their 20s. And I'm sure teens are getting into these games as well. What is the age of this game? I'm not entirely clear, but it's not as though, I mean, people use in their 20s, if you consider that, as opposed to what we're thinking about, teenagers trying to get into the gaming world, sports games. Let's see, this says for ages 14 and up. Okay, and this just came out, and it plays great, plays cleanly and simply. Not to mean simplistic, but it's great strategy, but it's something you can pick up and just get into. And that quick start guide really helps. When you're in this kind of text-based, heavy, black and white charts, and even if it's, the read-on boards and charts, there's still that kind of, just you're awash in numbers. If you're a kid today and you've got the choice, you're going to go to your video console, you're going to go to your Madden, you're going to go to your tablet or your Twitch, your Discord, your Steam, Pro Strategy Football. And I think even Pro Strategy Football, you just saw us talk with Kerry Batts, the creator of that game. It's got that arcade element, but it's still stats based. And it's just got, and people want to play as much. They want to play the old, as you said, they want to play games from the past 40 decades because there's that memory and that closer connection to, these historic teams and these great players. The current version of the 76 Buccaneers here. I mean, we remember that. We all want to go back to play that. This is the 50th anniversary of the 72 Dolphins' perfect season. We lived through that, or very close to it. Again, I mentioned Brian Haferkamp. He's in his 40s, I believe. I was in my 40s when I started this channel 11 years ago. And, certainly was a new era, an emerging era in social media. Obviously, there weren't as many channels as there are now. And that 10 years goes by, and you see folks coming out with a whole new perspective on sports gaming. I mean, again, I mentioned Philip Schwartzman told us about Bottom of the Ninth. He's designing a game called Sandlot Stars. And games like this, I mean, they're beautiful. They're aesthetic. This came out in 2016 from Dice Hate Me Games. And, it's baseball, but in a condensed, manageable form. It's in a way that, it has this cool aesthetic. It's vintage, and it's something that we can relate to, but I think it's something that kids can also get into as well. I mean, you look at sports card collecting, again, you talk about quarters. It was a quarter for a pack of cards, it was just all cardboard. Now it's all these hyper collectibles. It's all about disposable income, premium print, and the time to enjoy things. Now you look at this Bottom of the Ninth, you see they did here. They've got the player attributes on the back of these cards. It kind of harks back to that 74 Topps football set that we talked about in my, pathway to APBA football and pathway to tabletop sports. It's, they had 74 Topps football set had these kind of this little rules on the back of the set that you could play the game, play some sort of a football game. You see that this could certainly appeal to a younger kid, and you've got all the nice cool tokens. There's kind of that monopoly aspect to it, and certainly sports sim folks customize their games a lot. You just see Paul Barone doing all these custom fields. Ken Thomas has been using his saddle racing figures and posting some photos of that, the old APBA horse racing game. So, something like this, I think, is more the future. And I think just as APBA did in 2000, the companies that can bridge that gap and help bring kids along by following newer mechanics like this and you will eventually attract the folks that can get into something like this, that I feel is the way that we might want to get folks into sports. Now, we've interviewed teachers. Dale Schreiner, who runs the Lancaster Regional Tournament. We've interviewed Howie Mooney, talked about how his teacher got him into the game. You've got younger teachers these days. So just as with someone like a Brian Hafferkamp or Philip Schwartzman, they're a little bit younger. So maybe even a touch more removed from the golden eras of sports. I mean, how many, if you're a 10-year-old today, do you really want to go into the history of the Pittsburgh Pirates back to, I mean, do you even, do you even Honus Wagner? Where is, does anyone know? I mean, Honus Wagner was already a, mythical figure to us. So add 40 or 50 years to that, and it's even more distant a memory. But these games, with the proper storytelling and the proper aesthetic, could possibly draw you in there. So I think that's an avenue. Speaking of teachers, if I were a teacher, I might consider, if I were, into these kinds of games, I might make a project of, say, a set like this, which is the one of the original franchise all-star sets. And they will, if I might tell them, do a book report on, America in the 1900s through the 1960s, write a page on each decade, and maybe do it from the perspective of all these players, research these players, write a little bit about their lives, and write about where they came from, their towns, and where they played, and how all that played into the development of the country. I mean, that might be a stretch, and might run afoul of curriculum guidelines these days. Who knows? But it's something that might help engage folks. But I really firmly believe that it's just not the youth who are going to be into these games. It's going to be the retirees and the returnees and the 20, 30, 40 somethings. You're, again, talking about Philip Schwartzman. He's got the Euro game, folks, the people who play these types of games, 3-4 rounds of turns for everyone, with all the modern mechanics and all that. And then he's got the folks who play sports games, and they just there's a huge divide there. The people who play these Euro games might even like sports, but they just don't get into these older games. Okay? And to be sure that these older games, they were ahead of their time in a lot of ways, particularly in solitaire mode. If you look at what's happening these days, war games, DVG, the Leader series, all solitaire. You check out our interview with Chuck Siegert. This game weighs as much as 5 bowling balls, all solitaire, hugely colorful. I mean, just beautiful stuff, but the rules, unlike that squad leader over here, they're a little more colorful. They're still pretty, intense and all that. But it's just, people want solitaire games. They're more and more into that. These games are all over Kickstarter, are offering more and more solo modes. Wingspan, for instance. Now, I didn't support them on Kickstarter, but they have something called the Automa. Okay, so this is the solitaire rules. Sports games are all ahead of that. So, the solitaire player has a particular mindset. Okay, and that's where, as I say, I only ever picked up a sports sim to immerse myself in a world. I always loved the Saints and Falcons because we didn't see them on TV a lot. Again, if you're a kid today, you see them, you can't get away from football. Now it's on Amazon, and it's, streaming on your phone, and everything's kind of this red zone, quick as a flash thing. And you can just sit down and stream games with anyone on the planet. So, I think the future of tabletop sports sims as we know them is really going to be more about the discriminating older player who gets through all the whiz bang visual stuff, which I love too. I love to crank up Madden now and again, but it's a game that kind of, you kind of go to it. You kind of watch it. It's all spectacle and wonder and all this cool. You just want to see something cool and maybe interact with it a bit. But when you want to get into something like the 2008 Steelers and James Harrison, and that 100-yard pick six, you want to maybe recreate that. When you have that time and that inclination to immerse yourself, to go into a game and go into it, and let it overtake you, as opposed to kind of play at you, as a video game does. That, I think, is kind of the target, and maybe the pathway to gaming, that if I were running a game company, if I owned whatever, I might be considering something like that. What Brian Hafferkamp is doing with his array of quick play games, to modest time frame allowed to a very long time frame allowed, or again, what APBA did 22 years ago, the Superstars football thing. So, food for thought. What do you think about that? I know that APBA, I think, still has this video on the front of its on its web page, a homepage. These couple of kids, the next generation. We all want that in our hearts, to see young kids flocking to, whatever, either online, or going to a store like the Complete Strategist on 33rd Street in Manhattan, which is a fantastic shop. You want to see, 12 and 10-year-olds going in there and buying these really dense games and something like that. But I just don't know that. I think we're well past that point. Could change. Maybe the era of sports on the field changes, and there's something that captures the imagination in that more quiet and introspective way. Now, I have to give a huge shout out to the Robert Henry Memorial Tournament. John Cochran, Rebecca Peterson, Dr. Rebecca Peterson, and Pete Simonelli and Steve Scoff and Dave Small, those folks who, speaking of Lancaster, I mentioned the regional tournament there. Apple was based in Lancaster and moved to Georgia in 2012, 2013. The Bridesburg Boys and Girls Club outside Philly, Brian Cavanaugh had been bringing his kids to learn the game, and to their credit, when Apple moved to Georgia, the folks that I mentioned started the Robert Henry Memorial Tournament, which just had its 8th annual, I think. I have the T-shirt. I was down there. I forget what year it is because of the pandemic. They had to stop a couple of tournaments there. But they've got kids now in their 20s who started, roughly in their teens. So something like that certainly can work. I looked at these kids who were in their 20s and had played the game, and I'm like, man, that's me. To be around that kind of atmosphere and a bunch of old guys playing games, and these kids are totally into it. I mean, they're masters of the game. They're fantastic. They loved it. And other folks have tried that, and it can be a little difficult a proposition to get other, youth organizations involved in that. That's my take on the situation so far, pending further investigation of actual demographics. But I think the story is played out pretty well. I mean, certainly in our experience, just in these past 2 years of kind of resuming intensive activity, is that it is people who have finally gotten out of the workforce, or they're close to it, or they have some sort of time flexibility, and they really like to just kind of be alone and quiet and immersed in these worlds that these little cards and dice can create. And if you remembered the 76 Buccaneers, you can't even get them on a video game usually. I think the 2004 Madden, or 2007, you can only would allow you to get the video versions of these classic teams. And even then, the jerseys and the names are screwed up. You'd have to go and reprogram and all that stuff. So cards and dice have their place. I just don't know that looking at youth of today and youth in the next decade or two, I think that it's admirable to try to target them, expose them to these kinds of games that are a little more dense. But to be honest, I think looking at taking the lead from something like this bottom of the ninth, or this maybe baseball highlights 2045, where I guess it's cyborgs playing bots and borgs playing the game that we know, that you might take your 10-year-old to see, but it might take them something like this as opposed to something like this, to get them into the game. Happy to hear what you think. Please do sound off and tell me how wrong I am. That's always hey, it's just, it's about open conversation. And, maybe if you're inspired to design a game, speak to Joe Slack, totally unaffiliated. I'm unaffiliated with any company or design or anything. So, but, if some of this strikes a chord, think about your own game and how you might straddle that line and entice kids who have so many more visual digital distractions today than we ever could have imagined. And frankly, had we been subjected to them, we would have gone the same path. I mean, if you've got a video game or this, again, you got to be a very, special kind of kid who like to be immersed in, paper and numbers and words, as opposed to the big whiz bang videos and all that kind of stuff. So curious to know what you think. Sound off in the comments. Shoot us a note at applefootballcluboriginal@gmail.com. Start thinking of some cool games, and maybe some ways you can immerse kids. One thing I always thought of was getting one of these APBA games and putting them in the, those take a book, leave a book, take a book things you see around neighborhoods. Hey, it's getting to be Christmas time. Buy a game or two from the APBA shop or Stratomatic, whatever game you prefer, and slip one of these in one of those leave a book, take a book kind of a thing, or certainly you've got toy drives coming up as well. So think about it. Let me know. Sound off. Let other folks know what you think. And thank you as always for your time and attention.